in the workshop is Julien Bobroff. He has single-handedly changed the landscape of science education in France, and he will tell you how.
Thank you, David. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about both my topic of research, which is superconductivity, and how that could be used to engage large public. So I think it's a pretty unfair audience in the sense that some of you are much better specialists than I am in superconductivity, and I'm usually used to give these kinds of talks to high schools or to large public where there is absolutely no physicist. So just to frighten me a little bit more, can the physicists raise their hand? Okay. So you're obliged to pretend you are just high school students. So I spend most of the time speaking about superconductivity, but at the end of my talk, I'd like to spend about 5 to 10 minutes telling you how we used superconductivity to engage large public. I understood that this is a dialogue, so not just a formal talk, so I don't know what it means exactly, but interrupt me whenever you want to dialogue, okay? And I try to be not too long so that then we can have a larger dialogue. And if you have any questions that I would not be able to answer, the nice thing is that there are so many experts in the room that they would be able to engage the dialogue as well and answer instead of me. Just a little bit about myself to introduce the motivation. So I'm doing research in Orsay. Orsay is about 20 miles south of Paris, and it's a big physics center. It's one of the major physics centers in France. And I am myself an experimentalist. I'm doing nuclear magnetic resonance in these kinds of big magnetic coils. And I'm measuring mostly high-temperature superconductors or weird magnetic systems like quantum magnets, spin chains, spin ladders, stuff like that. I'm also teaching at the University of Orsay, where I'm a professor, and so I'm spending part of my time doing that. And finally, as I told you, I devote quite an amount of my time to the large public. And this is, for example, us doing quantum physics in Trocadero in Paris. If I take back these three items, these three activities of mine, we have three different kinds of problems there. We have less and less support for fundamental research for physics in France, and I think it might be the same in other places, and especially for high-temperature superconductors, I would say. We have less students in university. For example, in my university, which is supposed to be really one of the top universities in France in physics, we have lost about half of our students in the last 15 years or so. Okay. And the large public, I'm not sure, but my general feeling is that they are not that interested in fundamental physics anymore. Perhaps we are out of the glorious days of science, even though perhaps one should reconsider that judgment after the Higgs boson, which at least in France made a big news. So here are my three problems, and what I'd like to convince you about through my talk is that one could perhaps use fundamental research to engage the public. And ideally, we would hope that then it would bring more students to us. And perhaps we will convince the public so much that science is nice, that then they would vote to the proper politicians who would then support us. That would be the ideal scheme. I'm not absolutely sure that anything like that works, but I'll try to show you at least how we try to engage the public. So now, superconductivity. So what is superconductivity? So first, as it is a dialogue.
Excuse me,
yeah.
The light is making it hard to see.
Yeah, I have no idea on how to close that.
It's here to help.
So this is the interactive part of the talk. Because superconductivity is mostly a low temperature physics. Namely,
yes.
you still see me?
Yeah, this is perfect. You look like that guy right on top.
I made that for the primary school of my daughter. I asked her just before going to school, okay, who should I choose? And she told me, obviously, right? So the test here, the quiz here, is trying to sort out what is low temperature physics for a physicist. And so first, we're going to just reorder a little bit. So I would ask you for 1 or 2 minutes with your neighbor to sort out from the hottest to the coldest of what's happening here. So let me just tell you what you have. You have a human being, standard human being. The other one, don't care about the human being here, just care about this weird stuff which is in front of him, which is the coldest experiment ever achieved on Earth, to my knowledge, which was made in Helsinki, in the micro Kelvin group. You have a goat here. You have a room like that room, I would say. Here it's a car motor, so it would be where the car is running, of course, the engine, sorry. This is liquid nitrogen that we use when we do demonstrations to the public, so it's a very cold liquid. This is liquid helium, which is also pretty cold. These are hints. This is Vostok, that's in Antarctica. It is the coldest place where temperature was ever measured. It's a breaking record for the coldest temperature. This is the universe, okay, in between planets, among the galaxies. This is the sun, and I would ask what's happening on the surface of the sun, not the center of the sun. And this is just a flame of a candle. So you have 1 minute with your neighbors to sort out from the hottest to the coldest these various items. Go ahead.
Very hot.
Are you okay? I have to tell that in my daughter's classroom, the main debate was about Brad Pitt versus the Ghost. They didn't care about anything else. Okay, so what would be the hottest?
Brad Pitt?
So what would you say? The sun, yeah. Definitely. So the surface of the sun is about, okay, I put it in Fahrenheit. I have no clue what it is. So yesterday I converted all the degrees Celsius into Fahrenheit because it's 10,000 Fahrenheit, 6,000 degrees Celsius. I hope it makes sense. The center of the sun is millions, tens of millions of degrees. You have to realize that in laboratories you can achieve such temperatures, tens of millions of degrees. But at these temperatures, the main problem the experimentalists faced is where to put your stuff, because anything will melt, basically. So what they do is they make it levitate with superconductors. And I will show you how soon enough. After that, what would you say?
Flame.
This is a dialogue. You have to help me.
The flame of the car.
Yeah. So in Fahrenheit, that's 2,000. After that, what would you say? Yeah. Wow. You're not just a standard audience, I can tell. So that depends, of course, on the car, but it would be around 1,000. And then,
The goat.
the goat or Brad Pitt?
Goat.
The goat.
Yeah, the goat. Well, it depends whether Brad Pitt is real or not, in fact.
No, it would be
Brad Pitt is not real. Then,
the classroom.
and then, yeah, the classroom. Of course, it depends where, but let's say. Also, I went too fast. Okay, so Vostok now. So these temperatures you really have to take care with your hands and everything. You should not get out, basically.
Liquid nitrogen.
What would you say now? Liquid nitrogen, liquid helium, the Helsinki guy, or the universe?
Nitrogen.
Yeah. Oh, you are good. Liquid nitrogen, you are minus 320. And then?
Helium.
Yeah.
And the universe.
You're not allowed to answer you. And then, okay, the universe.
Oh, the universe.
That's interesting because I'm going to tell you soon how much this guy did, but what you have to realize here is that already in the 19th century they knew how to do liquid nitrogen. So they knew how to cool more than any place on Earth, which is already fascinating to me. And then, soon after I'll show you how, they were able to go lower than any possible place in the universe, in the natural way, in a laboratory. And how much lower? So this guy, I was not able to convert it in Fahrenheit, so I will tell you now in another unit. So in Fahrenheit it will be something close to that. The main point is that we have what we call the absolute zero. To define what we call the absolute zero, what we say is that, okay, temperature is movement of atoms, so this would be something hot, and this would be something cold, and this would be something very cold. So the atoms would not almost move anymore. And absolute zero would be the less possible movement of the atoms. There is still a little bit of movement because of quantum physics, but if we forget about that, you have something which doesn't move anymore. And that answers to the question, why can we not go below the absolute zero, which sounds a little bit weird because absolute zero is nearby this. And we cannot go below because it would mean making something less move than something which is already frozen and doesn't move anymore. Okay, so less movement than no movement, which is absurd. So this guy was able to go lower than 1 microkelvin from absolute zero. In fact, he was able to go at 100 picokelvin from absolute zero. So to put it in orders of magnitude, it is about 1 million times cooler than the universe. And it's about 1 billion times cooler than this room. So it is truly remarkable. But if you look at it on that scale, it doesn't look that remarkable. And if you look at there, you think, oh, you go from minus 451 to minus 459. Okay, you just add 8 degrees. But what I want to convince you about is that if you're comparing this liquid helium and this guy with these experiments, the atoms move about 1 million times less in this experiment, which was done in Helsinki in a special cryostat. So after this introduction, what we are concerned for the rest of my talk is these typical scales, very low temperature, at least liquid nitrogen, and if possible liquid helium, because this is where the fun will happen. So the story is about 100 years old and starts in this lab. I love to show the picture of the lab. You can see the lab in the Leiden Museum in Netherlands, because the story started in Leiden. So you can recognize huge pumps here, which were really one key issue in the story. And this white stuff is what we call a cryostat, DUR. So it's something very well insulated. And why I'm showing you this lab, because this is where superconductivity was discovered. And the reason why it was discovered there is because in this lab they succeeded to achieve the lowest possible temperature at that time. Namely, just before that lab existed, the breaking record was liquid nitrogen, which was about 20 degrees from absolute zero. And the big fight at that moment was to go lower than 20 degrees from absolute zero, which is already very cold. And everyone knew how to do it. The idea was to liquefy helium. And people knew that if they were able to liquefy helium, that would go lower in temperature. They didn't know exactly how much, but lower in temperature than liquid hydrogen. And the guy who won the battle is that one, Kamerlingh Onnes, with his team. So he was not alone to do the experiment. He's sitting still. In front of the helium liquefier. It is truly remarkable because not only did he succeed to liquefy helium, he also planned everything in advance to be able to do experiments in liquid helium, which was much more tricky than just liquefying helium because you have to bring wires, you have to bring thermometers, you have to bring materials to measure them. The motivation here was to see, is there anything new happening lower than liquid hydrogen temperature? And it is truly remarkable that they worked so much for that, and it was really a huge amount of work and really a nice achievement, because one could think, okay, if I know already what's happening at 20 degrees from absolute zero, at such low temperatures, perhaps nothing new will happen anymore, because everything is already frozen. Atoms do not move anymore, almost. But that guy was still motivated to look at that, and he was not alone at that time. And then, when he succeeded to liquefy helium, which happened at the beginning of the century, he tried everything he had to measure the properties. For example, they measured if stuff was still radioactive at such temperature. So Marie Curie came from France with some radioactive stuff in her pockets to put it in that experiment and to check whether radioactivity was still active at very low temperature, which was not that obvious at that time. So the answer is that it is still active at very low temperature. So you cannot just cool down Fukushima with the liquid helium. And they measured many other properties of the matter, and there were not that many surprises at that time. And they found exactly what they expected, the vibrations of atoms, the heat, etc., etc. And suddenly they made an experiment in 1911, and I love to show this because at the time when I was PhD working on superconductivity, the people told me that legend that Kamerlingh Onnes had done nothing in the story. It was the PhD student who did everything. And then Kamerlingh Onnes stole the discovery and got the Nobel Prize for himself. And didn't even put the PhD student on the publication, which is true in fact. But what is wrong in the story, and it was discovered only very recently, it was discovered only 2 years ago, so I want to show you this. Because now that I'm a PhD supervisor, I'm very happy with this. This is the logbook. This is the logbook held by the guys at the very moment of the experiment. And just to prove you this, so this is the hour, so you're in the middle of the afternoon. And the important point is here. So this is in Dutch, okay? And knick nul, something like that. Which means, so they translated it for me, mercury is almost zero. It is not mercury thermometer here. That logbook concerns an experiment that they did that very day, which was taking a piece of metal and measuring whether it was conducting better, worse, or the same when you cool it. The expectation at that time, there were many theories. One of them was to tell everything will eventually freeze. When you will go so low in temperature, that was the idea of Kelvin, even the electrons will not be able to move anymore. So they will not be able to carry current anymore. So your stuff will become insulating. It will not be metal. And so he did the experiment. The motto, I love to say that in the Aspen Center of Theoretical Physics, the motto of Kerman Ingones was, by the experiment, you get the knowledge. Okay. So he did the experiment. There were many theories at that time. And here he tells that the mercury, which was that piece of metal that he was measuring that very day, is going to 0. So just to show you the data, so, sorry, the end of my first story is that this notebook was written by Kerman Ingones himself. So the PhD supervisor in that story was in the experimental room the day of the experiment writing on the logbook. And what they found out, looking at the logbooks and at other historical documents, is that there were 4 of them that day. Kerman Ingones was sitting writing on the logbook. One guy was in charge of cryogeny. One other guy was in charge, I think, of electrical currents. And the key guy was in another room measuring on a galvanometer the resistance. The reason why he was in another room is that the pumps you saw were making the room vibrate so much that the needle on the screen, which was not digital at that time, was moving too much. So he had to be in another room, and he was shouting through a tube the results to Kerman Ingones. Like 0, 0, something like that. So the PhD supervisor was involved in the experiment and holding the logbook himself. And this is the data. So I just emphasize it. You have not that many points in that data. It's mercury, this is the resistance of the mercury, and this is the temperature. So you cool down when you go that way, and what you see is something absolutely unexpected. Unexpected for 2 reasons. One is that you have this very sharp drop, which is not what we usually expect in physics. In physics, things go pretty smoothly. Except when you go from ice, for example, to liquid, when you have a phase transition very abrupt. But otherwise, things don't go that sharp. So that was the first surprise. The other surprise is the way it goes. They expected the inverse. Remember what I told you. When you cool the sample, you might naively expect that the electrons will freeze and will not conduct anymore. So the resistance should go infinite. Drop to up there. And it does exactly the inverse. Namely, the system, the mercury compound there, conducts absolutely perfectly to 0 resistivity below a certain threshold, which is here 4 degrees from absolute 0. Just to tell you how surprising it is for a standard physicist, you have to imagine this simple experiment. So it's a third experiment, but it was made very soon after that, and it works very well. The experiment is the following. You just take a metal and you put a battery. As the metal has some resistance, when the current will flow through the ring, which is this metallic ring here, it experiences resistance, namely the electrons bump and scatter. So that heats a little bit. But now, if your ring becomes a superconductor, what it means is that you don't have friction anymore. The electrons do not scatter anymore. So in other words, if you take off the battery, the current should keep on turning up to infinity. You should have a perpetual motion, which is very surprising for a physicist. You don't have friction anymore in that ring, so the current should hold forever and ever. And that was tested in laboratories, and it is indeed the case. Do you have questions up to now? You want to dialogue somehow? No? Okay, I keep on.
No.
Second, yeah.
That's not the same as creating a perpetual motion machine, is it?
No, okay, let me be clear on that. You have 2 principles in thermodynamics. One tells you that you cannot create spontaneous energy. You have to maintain the total energy. And you do not violate that here.
Okay.
You just don't lose any energy, any friction. So it's a perpetual motion, a little bit like a perpetual motion in this ideally machine, where you have no friction anymore, but you're reading quantum physics here. So it has nothing to do with these YouTube fake videos where they will shoot something for 20 minutes and see the marble turning. But the idea is the same. And in our case, it is not, we are not cheating. We do have a perpetual motion. The way to measure that is that you create that ring, you put the current, you take up the battery, and you come 20 years after, and you check with what we call a ghost meter, so something which would measure the field created by that ring that has not changed by less than 1 billion.
Thanks.
The other big surprise came about 20 years after that in Germany and was discovered by Meissner and Hausenfeld. It was the effect of a magnetic field. up to now, I have showed you that there is a very surprising effect in a metal at very low temperatures. In that very same metal, when it becomes superconducting, and now we understand why this word, superconducting, because it conducts perfectly. And I think Onnes invented that name during his Nobel Prize talk. So now you have that incredible metal, that superconductor, and now you're going to try to put a magnetic field on that and see what's happening. And this is the experiment. So usually I do live experiments, I bring the stuff with me, liquid nitrogen, etc. But as I had to go through the custom, I didn't do so. So this is a very simple experiment to carry on. No. Ah yes. So, oh, no, sorry. So you put liquid nitrogen on that black pellet. That black pellet is the superconductor in my story. And this is a magnet, which creates a magnetic field. And if you put it on the top of the superconductor, it levitates. Not only it levitates, but you could assume that it would be just, I don't know, something like North Pole repulsing North Pole, like two magnets would push each other. The first obvious thing is that it doesn't seem to be the case, because if you play with magnets, it does like that, because it is not stable. Here it seems to be stable. But even better, as you have seen, we have turned upside down the magnet. So south now becomes north. So now it should be attracted somehow. And what's happening in the story is that it levitates again. Namely, the superconductor seems to adapt itself and repulse the magnet, whatever the sense of the magnet you are putting. You can do even better. You can now, because people thought at that time, oh, perhaps it's just induction. Induction, for those who don't know, it's something like you would answer inversely to the effect or to the phenomenon. So perhaps the magnetic field comes and you try to answer to him in an opposed way and to repel the magnets. And so they did this second experiment, where now you don't put the magnet like that. You put it right from the beginning, and then you put the sample. And does it work? No? Oh, this is slow. Sorry. Yeah. So same black pellet, the magnet is now on the top of the pellet from the beginning, and then you put liquid nitrogen. So you cannot have induction anymore in that story. But still, the magnet is expelled. That is truly a superconductor. And that's what we call Meissner effect. If you warm back the sample, you don't have superconductivity anymore, and the thing falls down again. So you have these two nice effects that you can almost show in the corner of a table, and which made a huge mystery at that time. Namely, we had to wait about 40 years to get the explanation. And it's not because not many people worked on it. Almost all the best scientists at the time worked on that topic. Einstein, Feynman, Landau tried to solve that problem. Why does a metal at low temperature superconduct? And this doesn't happen only in mercury, it happens in many metals. It happens in almost half of the elements of the periodic table, for example. And the people could not find the answer. The answer was very tricky. So it's not just three guys who found the answer. It was really a long story with progressive steps. But the very last steps came through these three physicists who got the Nobel Prize for that. And that one got the Nobel Prize another time for discovering and inventing the transistor. So he's the only one who got 2 physics Nobel Prizes in the history. And they came up with that theory of superconductivity. So let me explain to you the general idea behind this theory. You have to start back with what a metal is. And this is already not obvious. If you want to understand what a metal is, you need quantum physics. The reason why is that the metal is made of electrons which move freely, and each electron is a quantum object. And what quantum physics tells you is that each electron behaves a little bit like a wave. Okay, like you would have a wave in the sea. So you have to imagine a metal not in terms of small marbles like electrons which would move around, but like waves which would float around. So it's very tricky to draw. It's almost impossible. So we decided to do this weird red stuff, which would represent the electrons. What matters here is those small waves somehow, which tell you a little bit the shape and size of the electrons. Below you have the atoms, which are left in your metal, which are very well organized. In a metal, the electrons move freely from each other. What happens in a superconductor is something amazing. At very low temperature, suddenly, the electrons will do a weird dance 2 by 2. They will pair and doing these weird movements, opposed movements. But what matters here is this big blue wave. By creating this weird dance, they create a new wave, much larger, But the important point is now that all the pairs of electrons in the story will create such waves, and all the waves will perfectly superimpose on each other. They are coherent. So at the end, you end up with an amazing gigantesque wave. You don't have individual waves anymore, you have one single gigantesque wave. And this is what is really fascinating for the physicists here, that this can happen, because usually quantum physics, we think about it in terms of small objects. And here we have a truly gigantesque quantum object in all the matter. Now that these waves exist, it explains everything, because, for example, the resistivity, this wave is all the electrons tightening each other somehow and doing a collective movement. So you cannot accept, if you're such a wave, that one or two electrons will scatter on their own. All of them have to create this collective movement. So in an intuitive way, you can guess that in this wave, you cannot have each electron acting individually and bumping on atoms. So you don't have resistance anymore, because resistance is exactly that, one electron scattering. The magnetic field effect is a little bit more tricky, but quantum physicists know that this wave is very rigid, and if you try to put a magnetic field on it, it will break it eventually. So the wave wants to protect itself. And the way it does it is amazing. It just does it like that. It turns. Because if you put a magnet like that, and the wave begins to turn, as it is made of electrons, you will have supercurrent, currents of electrons, which will turn like that. And currents of electrons which turn like that create a magnetic field, which will oppose to the magnet and pull it. And now if you reverse the magnet, the current will go the other way around and will again get out the magnetic field. The idea for that wave is to get protected from any magnetic field. So that explains everything. The talk is almost over. We try to find nice images beyond that quantum wave, which perhaps is a little bit tricky to understand. So each physicist has its own image. I know that, David, you told me once about the ball in Vienna, and you have this flash mob that you did with ICAM. Okay, there are all kinds of ideas to try to show people how collective movements can emerge from individual entities. What I love is fishes. So those fishes will be the electrons in my metal. Each fish moves randomly in the sea, independent of the others. And suddenly, you can have, how do you call that in English? School. School. Banc de poissons in French. All your fishes will gather. And what matters in that story is that then you will have new movements. And you can see when you see this in the sea, very nice collective movements. So you have the idea that you have individual entities which suddenly gather together and create something more than just the sum of them. And this is what's happening in a superconductor indeed. So the story always ends up here with very nice formula. The theory is well verified at that time. There are major players of that theory in the room here. And the bad part of the story is that that cannot work when the sample is too warm, is too hot. The reason why is that the way these electrons pair together uses the atoms around. But if the atoms vibrate too much, that cannot work out. And the estimation at the time was that it could not work out much above minus 240 degrees. So in Fahrenheit, I have no clue how much it is. Minus 300 something, I guess. So the story ends up there because the materials found at that time were reaching almost that limitation, and the theory was telling more or less that there was a limitation. And then came these two guys. In 1986, Bednorz and Müller from Switzerland, who worked at the IBM Zurich lab at that time, and who discovered an amazing phenomenon in a ceramic, which was absolutely unexpected because these ceramics are very bad metals. And in these ceramics, they found out that there was superconductivity. But not only that there was superconductivity, but superconductivity was occurring at much higher temperature than everything known at that time, and much above that theoretical limit. And soon after, many other teams found out similar ceramics. Yeah.
How did they find it if the theory said it shouldn't exist? Were they iconoclasts or were they looking for something else?
The answer is in 3 steps. First step, when you're an experimentalist, you don't believe in theory, you try. Golden rule. Remember Camerlinghones? If he had believed the theory of Kelvin or the other guys at that time, he would have just expected the result and not measured it at all. So that's the first rule. It's so especially true in solid-state physics. Perhaps in particle physics you can anticipate the Higgs boson, which will happen 20 or 40 years after. In solid-state physics, usually you have surprises along the path, and you have a constant going back from theory to experimentalist and reciprocally. The other answer, so how these guys did, they were looking really for let's say, weird phenomena at low temperature in these specific ceramics. They were not the one who found that ceramic, in fact. It was French people who found it, but they didn't think about measuring it at low temperature. But these guys were smart enough to redo the experiment, remeasure the ceramics, looking at them at low temperature. The funny part of the story that I should not tell is that they looked at it thinking there would be superconductivity. And for a very specific reason, because they thought that the oxygens in that system would vibrate in a specific way which would make superconductivity much better than any place. So then they measure and they find amazing superconductivity and they get the Nobel Prize for that. After that, 25 years after, we think it was not the true reason. We don't think this vibration of atoms was enough to explain superconductivity. So for a false reason, they did this measurement, but I think they had the merit to do it. And they had the Nobel Prize, which was the shortest after the discovery in the whole history of Nobel Prize, because they had it just 1 year after the discovery. It was an amazing discovery because it renewed all the fields. Everyone then started to measure ceramics and found better and better temperatures. We are now at a stage where we have ceramics which are about 10 times hotter than the previous best superconductors. So if I tell you it that way, it sounds nice. Well, in terms of real temperatures, it is still very cold. You still need liquid nitrogen also to have superconductivity. So in terms of degrees, you have to help me there. So it's about the breaking records about minus 130 degrees Celsius. So that's already a little bit warmer than the moon's surface on the night in the moon. So it's not that cold, but still it's much colder than every place on Earth, including Vostok. It opened a new field of research. It was called, I think at that time, the Woodstock of physics. 25 years after that discovery, we have yet not understood what's happening. Well, let's say it another way. Everyone thinks he has understood, but we don't agree with each other. So in that community, there is still a huge debate about why these systems are superconductors. And it is really one of the biggest questions and mysteries of physics nowadays. Which is amazing because you could think naively, if you're out of the field, well, the big mysteries are the Big Bang, the Higgs boson and stuff like that, and not just a small pellet with a magnet on the top of it. But what I want to tell you is that in solid-state physics, we can have very simple materials which are as mysterious to understand as particle physics or Big Bang or whatever. I will not try to explain you the various theories at play these days. I will try just to show you why it is a complex problem, why we have not perhaps yet solved it. So why is it so difficult? The reason lies in the chemistry of the system. The system consists of atoms. My balls here are atoms. Superposed on each other, you can recognize some layers like that. And what matters in that story is the layer here, that you will see, I will erase the others, which is made of these brown atoms which are coppers, and the other ones are oxygens. So you have those squares of coppers and oxygens. If you are able to understand how the electrons work around this stuff and why they become superconductors, you have the Nobel Prize. Why is it so difficult? It should be very simple. It's not even three-dimensional, it's two-dimensional, simple squares, coppers and oxygen. The reason why it is difficult is because in these systems, the electrons are bound to stay along the edges of the squares. They cannot go easily here, okay, because of the chemistry. So in other words, if I'm trying to look at the electrons there, you're like in the streets of New York. You're stuck in the roads there, and you can go elsewhere, which is not that complex. It is complex because two electrons repel each other. Two electrons are negative and don't like to be at the same place at the same moment. So if you want to understand this electron, for example, and want to know what is its movement, whether it will go here or here or here or here, you have to take into account the other ones. You cannot just treat them as an average cloud, as we would do in a standard metal. You have to take into account all the electrons together, and all of them are correlated in their movements. Because of this repulsion and because they are stuck to these edges. That makes it a no-full metal, especially if you put too much electrons. That's very weird. In a metal, if you add electrons, it gets better. Here it gets worse. Because the more electrons you put, the more they are stuck, and the less they can move. And if you put one per copper, they can't move anymore. And that's an insulator. And indeed, these pellets, if you just put one electron per copper, they become insulating. Now imagine you have this stuff, which is insulator, not superconducting, not even a metal. And you remove only 1/10 electrons. So you still stay in a really complex system where almost nothing moves. It is precisely at that amount of electron that you get the best superconductor we ever know. And this is really paradoxical, this is really surprising. the fact that you have a movement of electrons which are almost frozen and cannot move at all, and it is in this very system that you get the best superconductors we know on Earth these days. This is our problem.
When you say best, what do you mean?
The best we have discovered up to now on Earth.
No, I mean, what quality makes them
Ah.
best?
The highest in temperature,
Ah.
and not only that, the more resistant to magnetic fields.
Ah,
The best in terms of currents you can put in it, so really the best. What I want to advocate here is that it is at the same time a failure, because we have not succeeded to agree with each other on what was the solution to that problem, even though there was a tremendous effort. There were tens of thousands of articles made till 1986 on that very problem, but still we did not succeed to find an agreement on the solution of the problem. And some people could consider it as a failure and could tell, wow, you did a mess. I mean, you didn't do anything for 25 years or what? And what I want to advocate is that it is the exact inverse. Namely, the fact that this problem is so hard to solve made us being more ingenious, obliged us to find new ways, new theories, new experiments. And it's exactly what happened. I would advocate that these black pellets were an amazing way to renew all the solid-state physics in the last 25 years. And indeed, all these weird names are each of them original theories or approaches to that problem. And probably I forget half of them, which usually doesn't matter, but here as I have many theorists of the field, I'm afraid that I have forgotten their theories, so forgive me for that. Not only it has obliged theorists to completely renew their point of view on solid-state physics, but also experimentalists. Because these pellets are so hard to measure, this very movement of electrons is so subtle that we had to invent new experiments, or at least new ways to use our experiments. And this is what happened here, for example, on a photoemission spectra, or a scanning tunneling microscope, or this is my own experiment, nuclear magnetic resonance. We had to push our limits because the problem was so hard and because there was so much competition. So I think it was really a way to renew and to open many new fields in solid-state physics. But still, we do not have an answer. Very recently, an even more puzzling result appeared from the group of Hideo Hosono in Japan and another group in China, who found that there was superconductivity almost as good as in those previous systems, not as good, but almost as the second best superconductors, which happened in systems where you didn't have copper anymore. You didn't have these oxygens, you had iron. Iron is very surprising because iron is supposed to make magnets. And as you saw, magnets do not like superconductors, they are expelled. And here we were using the very same atoms we use usually for magnets to create very good superconductors once again. And that again opened a new field of research which is very active these days, and many people fight, including me, about whether these systems are or are not the same as the previous ones, or whether we have an original physics again, and whether we're going to be able to understand it or not. Just to give you one example of the things I'm doing in my lab in this kind of experiment, I'm measuring this kind of spectra, and what we found recently in one of these systems, which we call the 245, was a very weird effect. We found out that this 245 system with iron grew naturally in layers. And many groups found that, and we did find it also with our experiment, a little bit like that French pastry. I don't know what you call it in English. It's a millefeuille in French. Napoleon. I have no idea what is the link with Napoleon, but it's French, I guess. So it's made of a pastry alternated with crème pâtissière. So it's very good. It's very good if you go in a good bakery. Otherwise, it's usually not good. So it's a good taste of bakeries in France. Usually, the millefeuille. So we call it millefeuille. Millefeuille means thousands of layers. Okay. So you can imagine these systems, these 245 systems, growing naturally with alternated layers of magnets and superconductors. This is very surprising because magnets are not supposed to coexist with superconductors or to be close to them. And these magnets are amazingly strong. We call them antiferromagnets. The moments on each of these layers, the magnetic moments are huge, and still they naturally grow together with superconductors. The thickness of each of these is about nanometer size. And this thing grows naturally like that. It's very interesting. It was a real problem for the community because we didn't understand the properties of the system, which seem to be both magnetic and superconductor. And in fact, it alternates between magnetic layers and superconducting layers. So we find very original phenomena even nowadays. I'm finished with the fundamental part of my talk. So if you have any question that I will not be able to answer. Yeah?
Question. You had mentioned that the wave activity in the superconductor is, you know, it actually reacts to a magnetic field, and would, if you flip the magnet, the wave actually reverses. And you said it wants to protect itself, which is kind of really logical. I mean, why does it really want to do it? It doesn't want to do anything. Why does it?
Yeah, the physics question would say its energy is lower, so it's better. So I don't think it's a good answer. But what you would do as a physicist is you would compare the situation if it was going back to a metal with the magnetic field, and if it was keeping on this large wave with the current turning like that. And you would compare the two situations and see which one is the most favorable from the natural point of view. You would find out that you would try to find out which one is the more favorable in terms of energy. You would find out that at lower temperature, in some systems, it will be the superconducting one. One of the reasons why is that it doesn't cost that much energy to the systems to turn, because remember, there is no resistance. So the electrons can turn around like that. It doesn't cost much energy. It costs to start the movement, but then, if the current is not too large, it works very well. You can have weird effects. If you put larger magnetic fields, you can have small, what we call vortices, instead of that big loop, which behave a little bit differently. And if you put a magnet which is too large, finally the wave will break and you will get back a metal. And we love to do that in very large field facilities like you have in the United States, in Tallahassee or in Los Alamos. And we have some in France as well, where you destroy the superconductor in purpose, putting a huge magnetic field and seeing how much it resists. And up to a certain point it resists, but if you put huge magnetic fields, at the end, the wave will eventually break.
So before you get to that point, if I understand you correctly, it's the magnetic field from the magnet which actually puts the energy, so to speak, into the system that would force the electrons to reverse rotation.
Exactly. If you were not to put any magnetic field, you wouldn't have that spontaneous rotation.
Right.
Yeah.
And to reverse it.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you flip it, you reverse it, and that's the energy that...
Yeah, and if you take up the magnet, that will stop.
Okay.
If it is just a single loop in the Meissner effect. Yeah.
I assume that there has to be collaboration between chemists and physicists for this work, because you're looking at...
Oh, yes.
And does that work well
yes.
or badly?
The field would not exist without such a collaboration. For example, in my case, for this 245 system, we work with German teams who made the systems, measured it with other ways, and we measured it. We are also working with chemistry in Orsay people. And you have also people who are physicists and chemists at the same time and try to do their own material. So you have different kinds of sociology, but it's hard to distinguish anymore. At the end of the game, I mean, chemistry is essentially physics. They are the same because you are just having orbitals around the atoms. So the knowledge, the how-to is different, and it's two different communities, but they merge with each other since the 20th century. But it's an interdisciplinary area for sure.
What would happen if you put two magnets above the superconductor?
Well, first they will stick to each other.
Well, what if the superconductor was big?
Oh, so then you will have, no, it's a good question. You will have two supercurrents for each magnet, and the two of them will float. I will show you after that some kind of setup.
Opposite polarities?
Yeah. You can also put a magnet below, a magnet above. You can play many games like that. Yeah.
You may have already partly answered this question, but earlier you said the thought was that 240 minus 240K, the atoms would vibrate too much and it would break the superconductivity. I'm guessing first it would be more accurate to say that the nuclei would vibrate too much. You don't mean atoms in the sense
I do mean atoms.
You do mean atoms.
But in your atoms, the essential of the weight is the nucleus, but it's really the atoms which vibrate.
So they vibrate. What happened to that problem when you got above 240K?
Okay. The experimentalist answer to that would be, let's try to find a way to check out whether this vibration matters or not. And the way we do that is we change the weight of the atom by using another isotope, so a larger nucleus, the rest of it being identical. So you take, for example, these copper or oxygen atoms, and you replace them with more heavy or lighter atoms, and you try to see if it affects the system. If you play that game in mercury, you will see an influence of the weight of the atoms, which really means that it's the vibration of the atoms which matter in that story. In these new systems, the effect is very small, much smaller than the previous systems. So one easy answer would be that. But then there are counter-arguments, etc. But I would have to enter into more sophisticated details, but we are more or less convinced that the vibrations of the atoms, well, I have to go back to the older superconductors. Indeed, mercury, the way the electrons attract is the following. One electron moves among the atoms, and the atoms are a little bit positive because they have given electrons to the system. And the electron is negative, so when the electron goes like that, the atoms come closer to him. They are attracted by the electrons. So now you are left with some atoms closer to each other than usually. If a second electron comes now nearby, he will see atoms closer than usual, which means more positive charges there. So he will go there because he is negative.
Right.
So he will follow the path of these closer atoms. So without understanding that, he will follow the other electrons path. So that's why you can have these kinds of movements. In these new systems, it's so hot that the atoms vibrate like that, so they forget where the first electrons went when the second one comes.
Really?
You see, because the first electron comes, attracts the atoms, but now when the other one arrives, the atoms have vibrated so much that they have forgotten the first part. It's a naive way to say that. Then there are more subtle arguments to argue that it's an electronic phenomenon which has to do with electron correlations, but this I don't want to enter into details.
Thanks again.
I have to say that some physicists do not agree with that. But it's a minority, I would say. I hope. I go on, yeah.
Well, does that mean that one expects at the end a different explanation for why superconductivity works at very, very low temperatures from why it works?
Exactly. At low temperatures, we understand.
Yeah.
Bardeen, Cooper, and Schrieffer were right.
And that's right.
And that's right, and that was confirmed experimentally and checked many times, and it's perfectly well, and it works well. At higher temperature, this, or at least part of this explanation doesn't seem to apply. Still, the wave exists. The electrons still go by 2. They still have this weird dance. But for example, the shape of this wave seems to be a little bit different in terms of symmetry. The only thing which really differs is the way they attract each other. The way these two electrons pair seems to be different. The rest of the story is almost identical. But still, it's a key point. We need to understand why they are able to do that here. Is it useful? I don't care. I have to say, I'm a fundamental physicist. I would not say that if I was looking for fundings, etc. But we are friends here. There is no French. I don't care. It's even worse. What usually I do for a living is trying to destroy them instead of improving them, and to see which atom destroys them the best. I love to play with impurities, for example. Anyhow, it can be useful, and I'm going to show you a full application. I have to be honest with you. It's not a major scale application, otherwise you would know it already. The reason why is that you have to cool them, and that's painful in terms of industrial applications. If you would want to have it in your house, you would need liquid nitrogen or liquid helium, or at least a very good fridge to be able to cool them down. So they are not large-scale applications, but still there are some of them which are useful, and I'm going to show you. The most obvious one is in fact the less used one. It's this one, doing wires. If you were able to replace the copper wires we use for electricity, you would have two advantages. First, the current would not hit the wire anymore, so you would gain a little bit in energy. Also, you would be able to put about 10,000 more current in the wire than in a similar copper wire. So you would gain in size, and that would be amazing. Of course, you have to cool them down with liquid nitrogen up to now, because we were not able up to now to find superconductors that we do not need to cool. Perhaps we will find them one day, but yet we didn't succeed. This is an attempt in Long Island, made by American Superconductors and Nexans, a collaboration between a French and an American company, where they did these wires. The wires are not that small because they need room to put the liquid nitrogen. So all along these 300 meters wires, you have liquid nitrogen flowing. But still it works very well, and it powers, I think, a town of 300,000 people. But it's not everywhere because that would be very expensive. That one is more useful. That one is on some cell phone antenna in the United States, in about 10 or 20,000 of them in the United States. This is a filter, an electronic filter. It allows you to sort out better the frequencies from the cell phones. So it allows you to have better sensitivity to detect the signal from your cell phones. So to put the antenna further away from each other, about 50% further away. So you gain room, basically. The problem is that you don't want a guy from the company to go and put liquid nitrogen each day in your setup. This is a small fridge, which is a bit like that, approximately, which is able to cool down just with electric power at about 70 degrees from absolute zero, or 50 degrees from absolute zero. We have made huge progress in how to cool the systems without the need of any liquid, just with an appropriate fridge. And that works very well. In that story, the fridge is like that, the superconductor is like that. And the superconductor is used in an electronic circuit because it is a very good system to create nice filters in electrons. Yeah?
If you have superconducting wires that are conducting alternating current, is there a limit to the frequency, and if so,
Oh, yeah. There's a
what
limit to the
produces
frequency because it
the
will hit, and there's a limit also to the amount of power you can put. And you will have problems, yeah, for sure. That's a good example I'm going to come back to with the LHC, in fact. I think the most widely spread and the most important application of superconductors up to now is this one. It's MRI. MRI would not exist without superconductors at the level where it is now. The reason why is that in MRI you need a magnetic field to have these nice images. And to do that magnetic field, if you use a standard copper wire, it will melt. Because you need to put so much current in it that it will heat and eventually melt. While if you use a superconductor, you don't care. You put your superconductor, which is in this box. There are 10,000 tons of superconductors in liquid helium, in a good DWAR, not to freeze you inside. And in this thing, they put current, and then they leave it on its own, and the current flows forever. And you have a huge magnetic field which allows you to do these kind of images, which are amazing. And which also use quantum physics in another way. By the way, that uses the Zeeman effect, and Zeeman made his discovery in the very same lab of Kamerlingh 10 years before, and also got a Nobel Prize for that. So, you wouldn't have that without superconductors, I would say. That's a less spreaded one, but I love this one. You use squids, which are magnetic captors, which are able to probe the magnetic field from your brain when you think. It's a very, very tiny field. But you can do that, so you have to do in this machine because they have to put liquid helium on the top of it, because they need to superconduct. If you do so, you have a very poor resolution. So that would be the squeeze, would be the black points here. This is a true experiment made in Paris, and where they do a stimulus on the hand of a guy and try to look at what's happening in his brain. You can do that with MRI, no problem. The only problem with MRI is that you will have an image which will take a few minutes to be taken. So you will not be able to follow the dynamics. You will be able to see, in average, what's happening in your brain. Here, look at what's happening. These 4 images I showed, which are experimental ones, were taken each 10 milliseconds. So you can follow the activity of the brain and where it happens in your brain each 10 milliseconds, like a movie. But of course, you have less resolution than MRI. So usually they use both MRI and these systems to be able to follow what's happening in your brain. You heard about the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson would not have been discovered without superconductivity. Because all the particle accelerators are made of superconductors. Because to accelerate the particles, you need magnetic fields, electric fields, which are huge. So you need to put a lot of current in a tube or in a coil. And here again, if you were to do it in copper, it would melt. So all these parts are made of superconductors. These are the first users of superconductors on the Earth. Finally, the less useful but nicest one is a train in Japan which levitates. So it doesn't touch the railway. Thanks to superconducting coils which are in the train and which create forces on the rails and which are repelled, and so the train can go without touching the rail. So there is no more friction. So that is the fastest train on Earth. It is even faster than the TGV. But it is very expensive, and so there is only one prototype on a few kilometers, and that's it. It goes up to about 400 miles per hour or so. I think I'm not wrong in the conversion. It goes very fast because it doesn't touch the railway, so there is no more friction. I'm done with the applications. Do you have any questions about that? Of course, if we were able to find superconductivity without cooling, we would have many more applications. We would first replace all the electric wires anywhere on the Earth, which would be a huge application. What I've tried to show you is that superconductivity can be shown on a small scale. It's very fascinating. You have these magnetic things, which is 1 centimeter, so you can really see it. It involves very fundamental physics, but also some applications. It's a very active field. And even more, it was the 100th anniversary last year of that phenomenon. So we decided that it was a very good example to use to engage the public. And now I'm going to just spend 5 or 10 minutes to show you how we try to use this phenomenon to engage the public in France. So I was in charge to organize that all over France, and with the help of many researchers, we organized this Supra 2011 festivities. So, okay, these are numbers to show that it worked well. So it worked well. All the green points are the places where it happened in France. So we involved many physicists from many labs in many towns. The idea was not to do something centralized, but to ask any physicist of the field to really take magnets, take superconductors, and go in the field. The number I'm the more proud of is this one. I think it's the world record, the number of people levitating. I will show you how we made them levitate. But we have made really 16,000 people levitate from the Earth. But we have many liquid nitrogen for that. So what did we do? The first thing we did is to create a lot of contents because there were not that many things on the web. So we created a nice website. All of these contents are in English as well, so I invite you to go there. Superconductivity.eu or supraconductivity.fr. So you have everything you want to know about superconductivity with video, with games, with whatever you want. And we created also many other contents. We created movies, we created animations, we created exhibits, everything which could be useful for anyone who would want then to engage the public. We also tried to go to the media. The media told us an hour ago, well, we don't want to hear about superconductivity anymore. You did that for the last 25 years. So we tried to find new ways to engage the media, and I will show you how we succeeded to finally seduce them somehow. And we had, for example, this is the French national TF1, which is the first French channel who did something for their news, main news moments. So we had many medias engaged, and I will show you why. And then we went into the field, researchers, so for example, these two are researchers from the field, and went to the public to show the experiments and to explain a little bit what quantum physics is. So we did it in many different ways. For example, we did it for kids with hands-on